Don't touch that console. The CEO snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of $1 million server room. And for a moment, the entire floor froze as a single dad in a security uniform stood there with his hand resting quietly on the edge of a system no one else could control, and no one in that room. Not the engineers, not the executives, not even the woman who signed their paychecks, had any idea that he was the only reason their company was still breathing. The lights above flickered softly, casting a sterile white glow over rows of blinking machines, their constant buzzing echoing like a warning no one wanted to hear. And somewhere deep in the system, something had already begun to unravel, slow at first, then faster, like a thread pulled loose from a $100 million tapestry. Ethan Cole didn't look like someone who belonged in that room. Not in his Navy security jacket, not with the faint crease lines of a man who worked long shifts and longer nights, not with the quiet stillness that made people overlook him without thinking twice. Step away, one of the engineers added, barely glancing at him, fingers flying across a keyboard that wasn't responding fast enough. Not tonight, not with everything on the line, and Ethan did what he always did. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped back, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes still fixed on the cascading error logs streaming across the main screen. There's a kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that carries weight, that watches, that waits. And Ethan stood in that silence like a man who had seen storms before they arrived, like someone who understood that panic makes noise but truth moves quietly. And as the alarms began to pulse in soft red flashes across the control panels, the room shifted from confidence to tension in less than 10 seconds. "We're losing data packets," someone muttered, voice tight, while another responded, "No, it's worse. We're looping requests. It's multiplying." And the CEO, Victoria Hayes, took one step closer to the central console, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her posture still composed, but her eyes narrowing just enough to reveal the first crack in control. She didn't look at Ethan again, not yet, because men like him didn't factor into decisions like this, not in her world, not in rooms where billions were discussed and deals were made in minutes. And yet, even as she focused on her team, there was something else happening, something quieter, something almost invisible, because Ethan hadn't stopped watching. He tracked the rhythm of the failure, the timing between spikes, the subtle delay in system response that no one else seemed to notice, and in his mind, pieces were already moving into place, not with urgency, not with fear, but with the calm precision of someone who had solved problems like this long before anyone in this room ever thought to call themselves experts. "We need a fix now," Victoria said, her voice lower this time, controlled, but edged with something sharper beneath it. And the engineers moved faster, louder, more frantic, their words overlapping, their confidence thinning with every second the system refused to stabilize. And still, Ethan said nothing. Because dignity doesn't interrupt, it waits, and grace doesn't demand attention. It proves itself when the moment arrives, and somewhere between the flashing lights and the rising tension, the truth stood quietly in a security uniform, unnoticed, uninvited, and completely essential, and no one knew yet that in just a few seconds, the man they told to step away would be the one who made everything stop falling apart. The alarms did not get louder, but they became sharper, like a heartbeat skipping just enough to make everyone feel it. And across the wall of monitors, lines of data began to stutter in uneven patterns that no one in the room could fully explain, not yet, not with certainty, and that uncertainty was where control started to slip. "We are dropping entire request chains," one engineer said, his voice tight, fingers moving faster now, but less precise, while another leaned closer to the main display and whispered, "This is not a standard overload. Something is feeding back into the system." And for a moment, the room filled with voices that overlapped without direction, each one trying to solve a piece without seeing the whole. Victoria Hayes stood still at the center of it, her arms folded lightly, her expression composed in the way only someone used to high stakes could manage. But even composure has weight, and the longer the system resisted, the heavier that weight became, pressing into the silence between commands, into the pauses between breaths. "How much exposure?" she asked, her tone calm, controlled, but carrying a question no one wanted to answer. If this continues, someone replied, hesitating just long enough to be honest, we could be looking at 8 figures in losses within minutes. And that was when the room changed, not louder, not faster, but deeper, like the air itself had thickened, like everyone suddenly understood that this was not just a technical issue. It was a moment that could define careers, reputations, futures. Ethan Cole remained near the back wall, just beyond the main cluster of movement, his presence quiet, almost invisible again, but his eyes never left the screen, not the numbers, not the patterns, because what others saw as chaos, he saw as rhythm, subtle, flawed, but consistent in its failure. There is a difference between reacting and understanding, and Ethan had learned that difference a long time ago, in places where mistakes were not measured in dollars, but in consequences far more permanent. And that kind of experience does not fade. It settles. It becomes instinct. It becomes the quiet voice that does not need to be heard to be right. Reboot the secondary nodes, one engineer suggested quickly. No, that will cascade the failure. Another shot back. Then isolate the cluster. We tried that. It did not hold. And the exchange continued, short, sharp, each sentence building tension without resolution, 3 voices, then 4, then silence again as nothing worked the way it was supposed to. Ethan took one small step closer, not enough to draw attention, just enough to see the deeper layer of logs scrolling beneath the surface display. And there it was, the detail everyone else had missed, not because they were incapable, but because they were looking too hard in the wrong direction, a loop buried inside a safety protocol, subtle, repeating, feeding itself with perfect efficiency. He did not speak right away, because timing matters, and dignity does not rush to prove itself. It waits until the moment cannot be ignored, and that moment was getting closer with every second the system continued to bleed. We are running out of options, someone said quietly, the words landing heavier than any alarm. And for the first time, Victoria's gaze shifted, not to the screens, not to her lead engineer, but past them, toward the edge of the room where Ethan stood, and though she did not say anything, not yet, there was a flicker of something different in her eyes, not recognition, not respect, but the beginning of awareness, the kind that comes when certainty starts to fail. Ethan met that moment without stepping forward, without raising his voice, his posture steady, his presence unchanged, and in that stillness, something else began to form in the room, something quieter than panic but stronger than doubt, the sense that the answer might not come from where they had been looking all along, and just beneath the noise, just beneath the pressure, the truth waited, patient, precise, and only seconds away from being seen. Then fix it, Victoria said, not louder than before, but sharper, the kind of command that did not ask for effort. It demanded results. And yet no one moved with confidence. Not anymore. Because confidence had already been spent in the last few failed attempts, leaving behind only urgency and doubt. We are trying, one engineer replied quickly, his voice tight as his eyes flicked between 3 different monitors, each one telling a slightly different version of the same problem, and none of them offering a solution that would hold. Trying is not the same as solving, she answered, her tone calm but cutting, and that sentence landed heavier than any alarm, because it stripped away the illusion that effort alone would save them. Ethan watched the exchange without reacting, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if the pressure in the room did not belong to him, as if he had stepped outside of it entirely. And in a way, he had, because where others saw a crisis growing out of control, he saw a system behaving exactly as it had been designed to fail under a certain condition, a condition that had now been triggered and was repeating itself with perfect consistency. We are isolating nodes, another voice said. No, you are isolating symptoms. Ethan spoke quietly, not raising his voice, not stepping forward yet, but the words carried just enough to reach the edge of the group, and for a brief second, everything slowed, not stopped, just shifted, like a ripple moving through still water. One of the engineers turned, eyebrows raised. Excuse me, he said, the tone edged with disbelief more than curiosity. Ethan did not react to the tone. He did not defend himself. He simply looked back at the screen and added, it is looping through the safety protocol, not the main process. That is why your resets are not holding. There was a pause, short, but noticeable, and in that pause, The room seemed to decide whether to ignore him or challenge him, and challenge came first. Security does not diagnose system architecture. The engineer replied, his voice tighter now, more defensive than before, because pressure has a way of turning uncertainty into resistance. A few quiet chuckles followed, not loud, not cruel, just enough to re-establish the hierarchy everyone was more comfortable with. And Ethan let the sound pass without acknowledgement, because dignity does not compete with noise. It simply waits for truth to surface. We do not have time for guesses, Victoria added, her eyes returning to the screen, dismissing him without looking directly. And yet something in her voice had shifted, not fully, not enough to change the moment, but enough to suggest that she had heard him, even if she had not accepted it. The system pulsed again, this time harder, a cascade of red indicators spreading across the display like a warning that could no longer be contained, and one of the engineers exhaled sharply. We just lost another segment, he said. Rollback is failing, another added. It is rewriting itself, a third whispered, and now the room was not just tense, it was slipping, the kind of slipping that happens when every option has already been tried and none of them worked. Ethan took one more step forward, small, measured, not forcing his way into the space, but no longer staying behind it either, and his voice came again, still calm, still steady. You are resetting the wrong layer, he said. The loop is inside your protection sequence. It thinks it is preventing failure, so it keeps restarting the problem. 3 sentences, simple, direct, and then silence, because he did not add more. He did not argue. He did not push. He let the words stand on their own. And in that silence, something changed again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that one of the engineers hesitated before typing his next command, enough that another leaned closer to the screen, scanning for what he might have missed. Victoria's gaze shifted once more, slower this time, more deliberate, landing on Ethan with a look that was no longer dismissive, but not yet. Respectful, something in between, something searching, and though she did not speak, the room felt it, the subtle shift in attention, the quiet question forming without words. Ethan met that look without flinching, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, and in that moment, the distance between a security guard and the center of the room became smaller than anyone there was ready to admit, because the truth does not announce itself with status, it reveals itself with clarity, and clarity had just entered the room whether they accepted it or not. Show me, Victoria said, and this time her voice was different, not softer, not louder, but stripped of assumption, the kind of tone that no longer dismissed, only tested, and the room felt it immediately, the subtle shift from authority to evaluation. One engineer hesitated. You cannot be serious, he said under his breath, glancing between her and Ethan, as if waiting for the moment to correct itself, but it did not. We are out of clean options, Victoria replied, her eyes still on Ethan now, steady, searching, and that was all the permission the moment needed, even if no one had formally given it. Ethan did not rush forward. He did not step in like someone eager to prove a point. He moved with the same quiet control he had held since the beginning, one step, then another, until he stood beside the central console, close enough to see the system not just as numbers, but as behavior, as intention. If I am wrong, he said calmly, you lose a few seconds, and he let that sit for a breath before adding. If I am right, you stop the loop, and then silence again, because he did not oversell, he did not argue, he simply placed the truth where it could be seen. You have 10 seconds, Victoria said, her arms lowering slightly, her posture no longer closed, and that was not trust, not yet, but it was something more powerful in that moment. It was allowance. The engineer stepped back, not far, not fully yielding, but enough to create space, and in that space, the hum of the machine seemed louder, sharper, as if the room itself was watching. Ethan placed his hand on the keyboard, not fast, not hesitant, just steady, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in doubt, but in alignment, recalling patterns, timing, the quiet logic beneath the noise, and then he began. 3 keystrokes, precise, deliberate. A pause, just long enough to observe. 2 more commands, deeper into the system than anyone had gone during the panic. The screens flickered, not violently, but noticeably, like a breath being held, and one of the engineers leaned forward instinctively. "What did he just access?" he whispered, but no one answered, because they were all watching now. Ethan adjusted one parameter, a small change buried inside a protocol that had been designed to protect the system, and that was the irony. The system was not failing from weakness, it was failing from its own strength, from a safeguard that refused to stop even when it was causing the damage. One final command, simple, almost unremarkable in its appearance, and then he removed his hands from the keyboard, stepping back into stillness as if nothing had happened at all. For a second, nothing changed, and in that second, doubt tried to return, quick, sharp, ready to reclaim the room. But then the cascade slowed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be seen, enough to be felt, like a storm losing its edge. "Wait," one engineer said, eyes widening slightly. "The loop? It is breaking," another added, his voice lower now, more careful, as if speaking too loudly might undo it. The red indicators began to fade, one by one, replaced by steady lines of green, and the constant hum of panic shifted into something else, something quieter, something almost unfamiliar in that room, relief. No one spoke immediately, not because they did not have words, but because they did not trust them yet, not until the system confirmed what their eyes were beginning to understand. Ethan did not look at the screens anymore. He did not watch the recovery unfold, because he already knew what would happen next, and instead, he stepped back to where he had been before, returning to the edge of the room, returning to silence, as if the center had never belonged to him. Victoria remained where she was, her gaze fixed not on the system now, but on Ethan, and for the first time since the crisis began, she said nothing at all, because there are moments when leadership does not speak. It observes, it recognizes, and in that recognition, something deeper begins to form. Something that cannot be forced, only earned, and in a room that had been filled with noise just minutes before, a different kind of silence settled in, not empty, not uncertain, but full, heavy with the realization that the man they almost ignored had just saved everything without asking for anything in return. No one clapped, not because the moment did not deserve it, but because it demanded something else entirely, something quieter, something deeper, and as the last red warning faded into a steady green glow, the room stood suspended in a silence that no one had planned for and no one quite knew how to break. "System is stable," one engineer finally said, his voice softer now, stripped of the edge it had carried before, and another added, almost cautiously, "All processes are holding, no more loops," as if saying it too confidently might undo the outcome. Victoria Hayes did not respond immediately, her gaze still fixed on Ethan Cole, who had already stepped back into the shadow of the room, his posture unchanged, his presence returning to the same quiet place it had always occupied, as if the last few moments had not rewritten the entire direction of the night. There is a difference between solving a problem and changing a room, and what Ethan had done was both, though only one of those would ever be spoken about. "What did you do?" one of the engineers asked, not confrontational this time, but uncertain, almost careful, as if the question itself needed permission. Ethan glanced briefly at the screen, then back to the floor, and answered simply, "I stopped it from protecting the wrong thing." And that was all. No explanation, no technical breakdown, just a sentence that carried more clarity than all the frantic discussions that had come before. A few exchanged looks followed, subtle, quick, the kind that happen when people begin to realize they have been looking in the wrong direction, and no one said it out loud, but the understanding moved through the room anyway, quiet, undeniable. "You accessed a restricted layer," another engineer said, this time not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, and Ethan nodded once, not defensive, not proud, just acknowledging reality the way he always did. "We were going to lose the system," he added, his tone steady, not emotional, not urgent, just true, and that truth landed without resistance because the evidence was still glowing on every screen around them. Victoria finally moved, one slow step forward, then another, until she stood where Ethan had been just moments before, and she looked at the console, at the parameters he had changed, at the simplicity of the solution compared to the complexity of the panic that had preceded it, and for a brief second, something almost like a smile touched her expression, not of amusement, but of recognition. The kind that comes when intelligence meets something it did not expect. "Everyone step out," she said quietly. And this time, no one questioned it. No one hesitated, because the tone was different now, not commanding control, but reclaiming it. And one by one, the engineers moved, slowly at first, then more decisively, until the room began to empty, leaving behind only the low hum of stabilized machines and the faint echo of what had almost been lost. Ethan turned slightly, already preparing to return to his post, to disappear back into the role that required nothing from him but presence. But before he could take a full step, Victoria spoke again. "You do not just watch doors, do you?" she said, not as a question seeking information, but as one confirming what she already knew. And Ethan paused, just long enough to acknowledge the moment without stepping into it. "I make sure people are safe," he replied, his voice calm, his words simple. And there it was again, that quiet dignity that did not need titles, did not need recognition, only purpose. Victoria studied him for a second longer, not judging, not measuring, but understanding, and in that understanding, something shifted that no one else in the building would see. Not tonight, not immediately, but it would matter, because respect, once earned in silence, does not disappear. It stays. It changes the way a person is seen, even when they return to being unseen. Ethan gave a small nod, not formal, not submissive, just respectful, and then he turned, walking back toward the edge of the room, toward the hallway where his presence would once again blend into the background. But this time, the silence he left behind was not the same as before. It was not ignorance. It was not dismissal. It was something heavier, something earned. And as the door closed softly behind him, Victoria remained standing at the console, her eyes tracing the lines he had adjusted, her mind already moving beyond the crisis. Because sometimes the most important thing is not what was fixed, but who fixed it. And the room, still quiet, held that realization like a truth no one could undo. The hallway outside the control room was quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that follows something important, something unseen by most but felt by all. And as Ethan Cole walked back to his post, the soft echo of his footsteps against the polished floor blended with the distant hum of a building that had just been pulled back from the edge without ever knowing how close it had come. He adjusted his jacket slightly, not out of discomfort, but habit, the small motions of a man who kept his world in order even when everything around him was not. And as he reached his station near the glass entrance, he resumed his place like he always did, standing, watching, present but unnoticed, the same way he had been before any of it happened. There is a kind of strength that does not follow recognition, that does not wait for acknowledgement, and Ethan carried that strength quietly, the kind that came from knowing that doing the right thing did not need an audience, only a reason. Inside the control room, however, the silence had not lifted, it had deepened, and Victoria Hayes remained standing where she was, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the console, her eyes tracing the system logs that now moved with calm precision, each line a reminder of how close failure had been and how simply it had been stopped. "Who is he?" she asked finally, not loudly, not urgently, but with a clarity that carried weight. And one of the engineers, the same one who had dismissed Ethan earlier, shifted slightly before answering. "Security, night shift," he said, his voice less certain than before, as if the label no longer felt complete. "That is not what I asked," Victoria replied, her gaze still on the screen, her tone even but unmistakably firm. And this time, no one responded right away, because the answer required more than a title, and titles were all they had ever needed before tonight. Another engineer spoke, quieter. "I have seen him around. He keeps to himself, does his rounds, never says much." And then he hesitated, as if realizing how little that actually meant now. Victoria straightened slightly, her posture returning, but not in the same way, not with the same assumptions that had filled the room earlier, and she turned toward the door, her eyes settling briefly on the empty space where Ethan had stood. "Find his file," she said, and this time, it was not a suggestion, it was direction, clear, precise, and carried with the kind of intent that does not fade once spoken. Back at the entrance, Ethan greeted a late-arriving employee with a simple nod, scanning a badge, opening the door, the routine uninterrupted, unchanged, And yet beneath that routine, something else moved quietly, not in him, but around him, because though he had returned to invisibility, the building itself had not forgotten. A junior technician passed by, slowing just slightly as he glanced at Ethan, not long enough to be obvious, but enough to suggest that something had shifted, a recognition forming without words, and Ethan acknowledged it with the same calm presence he offered everyone. Nothing more, nothing less. Inside, a tablet was placed in front of Victoria, the employee database open, and she scrolled through the information with measured attention, not rushing, not searching randomly, but looking for something specific, something that would explain what she had just witnessed. Ethan Cole, she read quietly, the name settling into the room with a weight it had not carried before, and as she continued, her expression changed, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough that those watching closely could see it, the subtle tightening of focus, the quiet recognition of a story that had not been visible on the surface. She stopped scrolling, her eyes fixed on a line that no one else could see from where they stood, and for a moment, she said nothing, because some truths do not need to be spoken immediately, they need to be understood first. Then she looked up, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "He is not just security," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried a shift that would ripple far beyond that room. Because once the truth of a person is seen, it cannot be unseen, and somewhere between the control room and the quiet entrance where Ethan stood, the balance of how he was perceived had already begun to change, not loudly, not publicly, but undeniably, like a story that had finally reached the point where silence was no longer ignorance, it was respect. The name did not leave the room right away, but it settled into it, quiet and heavy, the way truth often does when it finally arrives without announcement. And Victoria Hayes remained still for a moment longer, her eyes no longer scanning the screen, but holding on to something deeper, something that connected the man she had dismissed with the precision she had just witnessed. "What is his background?" she asked, not out of curiosity alone, but out of recognition, the kind that follows when something does not fit the story you thought you understood. The engineer standing closest to her hesitated, then glanced down at the tablet again, scrolling slowly, more carefully this time, as if each line now carried more weight than before. "It says here he was a senior systems architect, 10 years ago," he said, his voice quieter now, almost cautious, and that single sentence shifted the air again, not dramatically, but enough to make the room feel different, like a puzzle piece had finally been turned the right way. Victoria did not react immediately, but her posture changed, just slightly, as if something inside her had realigned. "For who?" she asked, and the answer came after a brief pause. "A defense contractor. High-level clearance, distributed infrastructure systems." And then silence followed, because no one needed to explain what that meant, not in a room filled with people who understood the scale of that experience. "Why is he here?" another voice asked, softer now, not mocking, not dismissive, just genuinely uncertain, and that question lingered longer than the others, because it did not have an answer on the screen. Victoria closed the tablet slowly, her fingers resting on its edge, her mind already moving beyond the data into something less visible, something human, because credentials explain ability, but they do not explain choice, and Ethan Cole had made a choice that no one in that room yet understood. "Bring him to my office," she said finally, her tone steady, not urgent, but deliberate, and this time, no one questioned it, not because of authority, but because of clarity, the kind that comes when something undeniable has already happened. Out in the lobby, Ethan stood as he always did, greeting, observing, holding the quiet rhythm of a building that moved without noticing him, and as he watched a group of late-night employees exit through the glass doors, he adjusted his stance slightly, the small shift of weight that came from long hours and steady patience. And for a moment, everything felt exactly as it had before. Then footsteps approached, quicker than usual, more direct, and Ethan turned slightly as one of the engineers from upstairs stepped into view, his expression different now, not rushed, not dismissive, but uncertain in a new way. "Mr. Cole," he said, the title unfamiliar on his tongue, and Ethan nodded once in acknowledgement. "The CEO would like to see you," the engineer added, and there it was, simple, clear, but carrying a shift that could not be ignored. Ethan did not react with surprise, He did not ask why. He simply held the moment for a breath, then responded the way he always did, with calm acceptance. "All right," he said, and that was enough. They walked together toward the elevators, the distance not far, but long enough for silence to settle between them, and the engineer glanced at him once, then again, as if trying to reconcile what he had seen with what he thought he knew. "You could have said something earlier," he finally offered, not accusatory, just honest, and Ethan kept his gaze forward as the elevator doors opened. "You were already saying enough," he replied quietly, stepping inside, and the doors closed with a soft sound that seemed to mark the end of one moment and the beginning of another. Upstairs, the office lights were still on, casting a warm glow against the glass walls, and as Ethan stepped out into the executive floor, the atmosphere felt different, quieter, more deliberate, as if this space operated on a different rhythm entirely. The assistant outside Victoria's office looked up briefly, then nodded, already aware, already prepared, and without a word, she gestured toward the door. Ethan paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the moment. Then he stepped forward and entered. Inside, Victoria Hayes stood near the window, the city lights stretching out behind her, and as she turned to face him, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal, no echo of the hierarchy that had defined their first interaction, only a quiet, measured attention, the kind given when something real has been seen and cannot be ignored. And for the first time that night, the distance between them was not defined by position, but by understanding that was only just beginning to form. "You are not just a security guard," Victoria said, her voice calm but firm, the kind of statement that did not ask for confirmation, only acknowledgement, and Ethan Cole stood a few steps inside the office, hands relaxed at his sides, posture steady, as if the words did not change anything about who he was, only how he was being seen. The city lights behind her stretched across the glass like a quiet reminder of everything that depended on decisions made in rooms like this. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some truths take a second to settle before they are addressed. "I read your file," she continued, taking a slow step closer, not closing the distance completely, but enough to show intent, enough to shift the space from formal to real. "Senior systems architect, high-level infrastructure. You built the kind of systems my company relies on." And she paused there, her eyes steady on him, not accusing, not demanding, just seeking clarity that numbers alone could not provide. Ethan nodded once, not proudly, not dismissively, just acknowledging what had been. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly, and his voice carried no regret, no explanation, just fact, the kind that stands without needing defense. Victoria studied him, her gaze sharp but no longer distant, because what she had seen tonight did not match the story on paper, not completely, not in a way that made sense without context. "People do not walk away from that," she said, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and for the first time since entering the room, Ethan looked directly at her, not with defiance, not with hesitation, but with a calm honesty that did not need to be rehearsed. "Some do," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have. Silence followed, not empty, but thoughtful, the kind that allows understanding to form instead of forcing it into words, and outside the office, the quiet hum of the building continued, unaware that something more important than a system had just been recalibrated. Victoria turned slightly, glancing toward the city for a brief second before looking back at him, her expression softer now, not in weakness, but in recognition of something she had not considered before. "You saved us $100 million tonight," she said, her tone steady, but there was something beneath it now, something closer to respect than authority, and Ethan did not respond right away, because he was not measuring the moment in numbers, not in impact, but in purpose. "I kept it from breaking," he said, his words quiet, almost understated, and that difference mattered, because one spoke of loss avoided, the other of responsibility fulfilled. Victoria let that sit for a moment, then gave a small nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just real. "Why stay invisible?" she asked, and this time, it was a question, not a test, not a demand, just a genuine attempt to understand a choice that did not fit the world she knew. Ethan exhaled softly, not tired, not burdened, just thoughtful, and when he spoke, His voice carried the same steady rhythm it had all night. "Because not everything important needs to be seen," he said, and there it was, the kind of answer that does not end a conversation, but deepens it, because it shifts the focus from what is obvious to what is true. Victoria held his gaze a second longer, then nodded again, slower this time, as if something inside her had settled into place. "You could run this place," she said, not lightly, not as flattery, but as a statement grounded in what she had witnessed, and for a moment, the offer hung in the air, not official, not structured, but real enough to matter. Ethan did not step forward. He did not lean into the possibility. He simply stood as he was, grounded, steady, and then he shook his head once, gently. "I already have a job," he replied, and there was no defiance in it, no rejection of opportunity, only clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what matters and what does not. Victoria did not argue. She did not push, because for the first time that night, she understood that value does not always follow ambition, and respect does not always seek promotion. And as the silence returned, it was no longer filled with tension or uncertainty, but with something far more rare, mutual understanding, quiet, steady, and complete enough that neither of them needed to say anything more to recognize it. The door closed softly behind Ethan Cole as he stepped back into the hallway, and for a moment, he paused, not because he needed to, but because the silence felt different now, heavier in a way that carried meaning instead of absence. And then he continued walking, steady, unhurried, returning to the place where he had always stood, the place where no one had expected anything from him except presence. Downstairs, the lobby lights reflected faintly against the glass doors, and the night had settled into its usual rhythm, quiet footsteps, low voices, the distant hum of a city that never fully slept, and Ethan resumed his position just as he had before, scanning badges, opening doors, offering a simple nod to those who passed by. The same actions, the same calm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But something had changed, not in what he did, but in what had been seen, because upstairs, in a room of power and pressure, the truth about him had surfaced, and truths like that do not disappear, even when the person carrying them chooses to remain unseen. Victoria Hay stood alone in her office for a while longer, the city stretching out beyond her like a reminder of scale, of responsibility, of how close everything had come to slipping beyond control, and her thoughts returned not to the system, not to the numbers, but to the man who had fixed it without asking for recognition, without needing to be seen. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not seek titles or validation, and when it reveals itself, even for a moment, it leaves something behind that cannot be ignored, a quiet shift in how the world is understood. The next morning, the building would wake up as it always did, meetings scheduled, reports reviewed, conversations moving quickly from one priority to the next, and most people would never know how close they had come to losing everything the night before. They would not know about the loop, the failure, the moment when nothing seemed to work, and they would not know about the security guard who stepped forward when no one else could. But a few would remember, not loudly, not publicly, just enough to carry a different kind of respect in the way they looked at him, in the way they spoke when he passed, in the way silence followed where laughter once had been. And Ethan would continue, just as he always had, picking up his daughter after school, making sure she got home safe, helping with homework at the kitchen table, living a life that did not need headlines to matter, because dignity does not need an audience, it only needs consistency. In the end, the system was saved, the company moved forward, and the night became just another story that would never be told in meetings or reports. But the real story was quieter than that. It was about a man who chose character over recognition, purpose over position, and in doing so, reminded an entire room that true strength does not raise its voice. It stands firm when it is needed most. So the question is simple. When the moment comes and no one is watching, would you step forward quietly and do what is right? Or would you wait to be seen before you act? And if stories like this speak to you, if you believe in dignity, second chances, and the quiet power of doing the right thing, take a moment to subscribe, because sometimes the strongest stories are the ones that do not need to shout to be heard.